The deadlock between the US and Iran has never seemed more fragile. The whole world has been on high alert after the reports of massive strikes on military targets and the internal pressures to end the conflict entirely. But as we sit here waiting for the conflict to boil over, aren't we forgetting something? The Iranian people are still without infrastructure, an economy, assurances, and most importantly, the attention of the people who are meant to save it. This is The Deep Dive. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, Jacob Laznik. The United States and Iran signed an MOU over a month and a half ago, and yet the negotiations between the two is still stuck in a limbo. Mixed reports of the status of the talks, strikes on military assets between the two sides, as well as raised alertness levels in Israel, have cast a lot of doubt on the chances of this agreement succeeding, but also bringing it to the forefront of the headlines. While this has been happening, a group of people have been in limbo since last December and have seemed to have been forgotten by the international community. I'm of course talking about the Iranian people. After nationwide waves of protests following economic turmoil, 2 rounds of conflict, and the massacre of tens of thousands of their own people by the regime, the people of Iran have never felt more in danger and more alone. To talk about the status of the conflict, the Iranian people, and possibly what we could do to help, I'm joined by journalist and Iran expert, Jonathan Harounoff. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us again.
It's been a while. It's great to be with you.
Yeah. So I know you were on a previous episode of Deep Dive, but I wasn't present. But the last time that we spoke personally was at the end of December of last year when the protests in Iran really started to kick off. And, we had these conversations about, is this different than previous waves of protests? And is this going to be the, the movement that topples the regime? Obviously, since then, many things have changed. We've had 2 rounds of conflicts with Iran. And obviously, the United States and Iran are currently in negotiations. So I really want to observe kind of what's going on in Iran now with all of these changes. So first of all, I think the big thing that really doesn't get talked about a lot anymore is the Iranian people themselves and the protest movement and what happened to it. Obviously, there was a very long multi-month internet blackout, so it was literally impossible to understand what was going on. But now that the proverbial lights have come back on, what have you seen?
Well, thanks again for having me on, and you're certainly right. The fact that there was a blackout for such a sustained period of time. In fact, I don't quote the UN positively very often, but their human rights departments stated quite explicitly and shockingly that it was the longest internet blackout in recent history in a country. So that certainly contributed to us not hearing about the Iranian people themselves. And an observer might, assume therefore that the Islamic Republic and the people of Iran share the same views towards the outside world, towards Israel and the United States. But what I found is quite the opposite. And when there was first talk of the MOU, the memorandum of understanding, to many Iranians inside Iran and in the diaspora especially, to them this was a memorandum of very little understanding, of misunderstanding, because the Iranian people's rights and protections weren't really discussed at all. Maybe it would have been discussed at a later period, but there was a healthy amount of concern and skepticism that this regime could once again, with a degree of impunity, slaughter tens of thousands of Iranians, and nothing would happen. So that was a huge cause of concern for the Iranian people. But even though we're not hearing much activity by way of protest, I think it would be inaccurate to say that there's no discontent or anger. There's a huge amount of anger and blame directed at the Islamic Republic for the condition of the Iranian people. Just fundamentally, the fact that the Islamic Republic seems to have an endless reserve of resources for missiles and anything military, yet it has very little to provide the Iranian people, speaks volumes. And the Iranian people really blame their economic misery on the Islamic Republic's very expensive and dangerous and misguided foreign policy. So the embers of revolutionary spirit and anger and outrage are still very much there. And I suspect it's only going to take another, spark, another incident like the killing of Masa Amini or some kind of protest that begins small and explodes nationwide for that to become take center stage once again.
Absolutely. And I do want to get into that in a sec, but I do want to touch upon something you just said, because when I think about, what's been happening to the Iranian people, there's something that I still can't really wrap my head around, and it like blows my mind. And that is, of course, the January 8th, January 9th massacre. Um, because you said that one of the complaints with the MOU is that there's this feeling that if, the regime gets preferable terms, then it can go back, it can like essentially slaughter tens of thousands of people with impunity. And it makes me remember that this kind of already happened. And I, I just don't understand if the reports are even remotely correct to what happened. I don't understand how, independent of the negotiations between, America and Iran, how there aren't global calls for an investigation or probe into what is essentially, like, in that time span, the biggest massacre since like Babin Yar. Like, this is a massive, insane, brutal massacre that happened in such a short window of time. And, obviously, like the whole rest of the world, we're used to double standards. No one says anything, but the fact that it just kind of happened, and it's also not part of the discussion. It's not part of the negotiation in terms of, like, security and like and reparations and guarantees for the security of the Iranian people after the regime openly killed tens of thousands of its own people already. That, I don't know. That's just like hard for me to process. So I don't know if, like, from your position, if do you ever hear any policy talk, discussion, anything with some kind of, I don't know, like, leverage or status regarding to this incident, or is this essentially just kind of been like forgotten?
I don't think it's been forgotten, but I also don't think it's taking center stage in these discussions, which is also disappointing. But you're right, the numbers are truly staggering. They're almost inconceivable. And one would expect places like the United Nations, where I spent 2 years, for that to be discussed almost ad nauseum, but it really
Right.
wasn't. And the only time Iran itself was being discussed was in the context of the Islamic Republic and the government, but very rarely were they talking about the people of Iran. It took, if we rewind back to December 2025, January, it took about 2 or 3 weeks for the Secretary General himself to issue any kind of statement of concern, condemnation,
Right.
once those protests and subsequent slaughter started to happen. And had that same thing happened in Gaza or wherever, or in Lebanon, you would have seen a rapid turnaround at the UN within hours. So it really is concerning and hard to understand why. And I think I agree with you. I think more should be done to talk about the suffering of the Iranian people. But I also think that we still don't know all the stories and all the details. You're still getting glimpses of the horrors, some of the anecdotes uh, from family members, from brave reporters, places like Iran International and elsewhere. But I think it's also there's a huge information gap. And I think once we start to fill that information gap, perhaps greater calls for accountability and action will be taken. But for now, it's we're not seeing enough of that.
No, absolutely. And so when you look at Iran today, another thing that is really hard for me to wrap my head around is, when we last spoke in December, Iran was already in a terrible place. Economically, it was doing, it was in trouble. There was basically no water in the wells and the reserves at the time that we spoke. There's almost no electricity. There were like mandated temporary blackouts to preserve electricity. They were talking about how they're going to have to relocate the capital outside of Tehran because it was becoming too expensive. And from then until now, we also had two rounds of conflict where a lot of their very critical infrastructure has been heavily damaged. So how, I don't understand, how is this regime still standing? How are they, I don't mean like in like hearts and minds, but like physically, how are they still able to support themselves? How are they not choked out yet? Have they just been saving these resources in the bunker for the final battle, or like, how, like, physically this like the math doesn't add up that they're still able to sustain themselves at this pace.
Well, I would say that the maths, um, it does add up because everything the Islamic Republic has been funneling everything it has basically and preparing for decades for this very moment. And that's why
Mm,
you see sort of a tale of two Irans. You have on the one side Iranian people suffering, from high unemployment, super high inflation, can barely afford to have food on the table. And yet on the other hand, the government has all of this cutting edge technology that is inflicting damage and sowing chaos across the region, damaging, the places across the Gulf, and threatening US Army bases. So I think that explains it. But the other thing is the Islamic Republic's greatest strength at this very point in time, and I'll qualify what I'm saying, is that they're not a democracy. That is absolutely
mm,
their greatest strength. And by that, I mean, they don't have to worry about the polls. They don't have to worry about the prices in the petrol station. They don't have to worry about mass discontent among the Iranian people. In fact, they just ignore it and they slaughter their own people. Whereas on the flip side, you have the United States, a democracy, Israel, a democracy. At the United States, you've got the midterms coming up. That's something that President Trump is cognizant of. You've got um, people complaining about fuel prices and like the ripple effects of what's going on at the Strait of Hormuz. And the Islamic Republic is, of course, suffering from all of that, but they don't care. They know that they're not going to defeat Israel and the United States militarily in a conventional kinetic war. But what they can do, or what they're trying to do at least, is outsuffer them, defeat them in a war of attrition, because they're not bound by the same pressures and democratic constraints that Israel and the United States are. And that's why the Strait of Hormuz is such a valuable bargaining chip for the Islamic Republic, because they are essentially suffering, but they know that the other countries around them are also suffering, and they know that if they are able to jeopardize a very important waterway that sees 20% of LNG, liquefied natural gas, and crude oil pass through it, and if they're able to threaten that supply and that waterway, that to them is a significant victory, and that's why they've been um, framing it as such for so long.
yeah. So when we look at the current state of the MOU, or I guess not the MOU, but the negotiations themselves, or the lack thereof, or the flip flopping, or the promises that talks will renew and then they don't, or one side, mainly the U.S., saying that talks have resumed and Iran denying it and say that they haven't. What is what is your take on essentially the state of how these negotiations have been handled? I guess there's two kind of questions in here. One is being, is it the right thing to do to kind of approach this MOU style negotiation tactic that the administration is currently approaching, or should Israel and the U.S. go back to military action until they're able to negotiate from a more like a more leveraged position? And if the negotiation is the right way to go, is the way that the U.S. is going about it now the proper way to do it, or is there some significant gap that the U.S. is kind of not seeing?
Think it's very easy to just say that, we should just go to war, we should throw all diplomatic efforts out of into the toilet and just bomb everyone and do all of that. But I don't, there are significant risks and long-term challenges associated with that. So
Yeah.
I always see tremendous value in at least pursuing or trying to pursue diplomacy. And that's why I think President Trump and his administration deserve a huge amount of credit for at least giving diplomacy a go. And you're seeing it's almost like Groundhog Day, the number of times where there are attempts to renew or revive talks. At the
Yeah.
same time, you're seeing a huge amount of psychological warfare being played out by the Islamic Republic, who are, not only are they not really approaching the negotiation table, they're denying that it's ever taking place. I think the truth, what's really happening is, since there are so many different layers and it's quite fractured at the moment inside Iran, is there are talks happening through various mediators at various levels at in various times, and and that is seen as a kind of progress. But I will always retain a healthy dose of skepticism when it comes to the Islamic Republic, just because that if the past is any guide, they've used those those tools of diplomacy and democratic tools that we all cherish for their gain, to play the long game. Again, because while the United States is bound by terms of administration and midterms and elections, the Islamic Republic isn't. Their leaders are going to be in power until they die, or until they're changed. So they're able to play the long game. They're able to stall, and that's something that they really have a mastery of. And then while they say that they're, not not launching any attacks on any of their neighbors, they're also, apart from being master diplomats, they're also master delegators. So they know how to delegate to some of their proxies to carry out attacks on their behalf, while also staying a step away and saying that they're not getting involved. So that's, I think, the way they're viewing this. But fundamentally, I think diplomacy is valuable, and it should always be pursued. But there are also times when those avenues have been exhausted.
And obviously, it's impossible to really tell what this would look like. But if let's say, for example, an agreement was reached today, and we'll put aside what exactly those terms would be, but terms were agreed upon to actually solidify a concrete end of conflict. I'm curious as to how you see what a post-Iran, as in the regime, and post-Iran, its people, would look like, because so much has happened since our last discussion. Iran has essentially, in a way, almost, I don't want to say alienated, but really pushed away any of its allies in the region, and has really distanced itself from everyone, because, yes, they attacked Israel, and yes, Iran attacked a bunch of US assets in the region, but Iran also really just attacked many of its neighbors, and we're not talking about US assets. Like, Kuwait really got the brunt of it. I think Kuwait had more missiles and drones sent to it than Israel, and not all of that was to assets. Uh, yeah, and the UAE, they even, like, even Qatar is now, like, disgruntled with Iran, and it's just very, like, not that it was the most friendly, neighbor in the region, but now it's even more isolated, and its economic position hasn't gotten any better. So yeah, I just guess, like, how does the regime continue to survive is my first question. And then I think my second question is that if we look at the people, we know they're disgruntled. You said there just has to be another incident that sparks a wave of protests, but I really wonder, what could that kind of event even look like? Because the Masa Amini protests, it was very easy to pin it to an incident, and I know that you have a book on this, so you can talk about this way more in depth than I can. And then, the protests we had in December was kind of like an amalgamation of unrest and anger at the situation. But at the end of the day, after everything that has happened in Iran, because think that they've now also, been under fire from multiple countries and also their own regime, and they have nothing, and they had tens of thousands of their own people massacred in the streets, essentially by, the regime's own forces and by militias. So when that has become your kind of, like, norm for the past few months, what can you even consider to be like a watershed moment to start a new wave of protests, when for the past 8 months they've just been consuming the worst of the worst?
Well, I think a number of things absolutely have to happen in order for there to be any kind of prospect for transformation in Iran. I don't think a mass uprising on its own is enough. I think that is a crucial ingredient, but alongside that, you need serious and tangible international support by the Western governments, and also by international institutions like the United Nations. They actually need to step up by disassociating from the Islamic Republic and offering different ways to support the Iranian people. And then the third ingredient that really also hasn't happened to a great extent is finding ways to fracture and fragment the
Hmm.
military infrastructure of the Islamic Republic. think those three things, once they happen in unison, could really be promising. But one of the reasons, in answer to your question as to why I think the Islamic Republic has survived for so long, is because if we just go back into history, the Islamic Republic came about as a result of a quite transformational revolution, perhaps one of the most pivotal moments in recent modern Middle Eastern history.
Mm,
And they know what it takes to bring about a huge revolution. And at the same time, they also know what it takes to stamp one out. And
mhm,
every single one of the major uprisings that we've seen in Iran's recent history, they've achieved some things, but eventually they've all been stamped out through brutal, brutal violence. And I think that's the key here, the fact that the Islamic Republic has no qualms about disappearing and executing and uh, repressing its own people to prevent any kind of possibility of an uprising, a successful one, from occurring. And that's why I would argue that perhaps the best chance of a successful uprising inside Iran is perhaps to follow the model of 79, where the spiritual leader and the eventual leader and father of the Islamic Republic, Ruhollah Khomeini, very much spearheaded this movement from the outside while he was in exile in Iraq and in Turkey and in France, and he only came back to Iran once the Shah had already left. And I think since anyone who becomes an opposition voice inside Iran and gains popularity is going to be targeted very quickly. Perhaps the best avenue is to cultivate an Iranian leader from the outside who has strong ties with Iranian people and is, of course, Iranian, has that bonding connection, but has also a degree of safety and security, even though it's not absolute, since the Islamic Republic's tentacles
right.
have very much been globalized. But I think that's perhaps the strongest and best chance of any kind of uprising from occurring.
Yeah, and then that brings me to the, at the end of the day, the real important question is, what can I or what can we as people on the outside do to either help or at least demand from our officials to help? Like what we can say, we need to help the Iranian people, we need to support the Iranian people, we have to listen to them. But what are the actual, physical, tangible things that other either countries or, like bodies like the UN or just anyone can actually be physically requesting and say, like, here's our list of demands that must happen in order to actually help and alleviate the Iranian people and actually it be the Iranian people and not just the regime? Like, what does that actually look like?
I think there are many things that can be done. The most basic and perhaps overlooked thing that can be done is, and everyone can do it. Sometimes, more often than not, I see people talking about the future of Iran and its people as a kind of passive exercise where they play no role in forging that future. And I really disagree with that. I think we all play a tremendous role and can help shape Iran's future for the better. What I would say at a most basic level is many people, whether they're in Israel or in the United States or in the UK, know Iranian people in the diaspora, Jewish and non-Jewish. I think the first most basic thing I would do is to reach out to those people, whether they're friends or relatives or colleagues, or not close friends, maybe acquaintances, and learn about their past, learn about their history, learn about their present as well, if they have family still in Iran, and ask them how you can support them. And you'll be, first of all, you'll be, I'm sure, shocked and amazed and marveled at their story, but they will give you very tangible advice and suggestions on how to help, whether it's NGOs who are actively talking about the plight of Iranians inside Iran and actively supporting them, raising awareness about what the Islamic Republic is doing inside Iran and abroad. That's, I think, one of the first most basic things that I would do, that really people sometimes don't really realize that the Iranian people themselves, they're the window into what's happening inside Iran. And we're fortunate to have such a huge Iranian diaspora community. I mean, it's unfortunate for the diaspora, many of whom want to go back to a post-Ayatollah Iran.
No, of
But
course.
they're one of the greatest windows into what's happening, and I think they need to be utilized much more and learn more about them, and they'll be able to give immense suggestions as to how to help further.
And now I think this is a very complicated question to ask, but it does obviously play into the bigger picture. And as you know, elections are coming up in Israel. October 27th, I believe, is the election date. And also, the Knesset has dissolved, and all of the respective parties are obviously dealing with primaries and strategy and messaging, and tentatively trying to form their own governments. Should they be the leading party, and et cetera, et cetera. Um, Obviously, that's a natural part of the election process, but again, also kind of quietly under our noses, I feel that other than when being prompted, the kind of idea of Iran is sort of like slipping out of definitely the public discourse. And I also think that obviously when it comes to the messaging by all of the government members and by all the parties and the party leaders, um, Iran isn't even close to like the top 5 or top 10 issues being discussed because, they're on the campaign trail, and there's things at home that have to, be addressed, and we have to make promises. And on day one, I'm going to do ABC, whatever. Um, do you would you think it's correct to say that collectively Israel is also slightly getting distracted and not having Iran at the forefront of its agenda? And do you think that, politicians right now who are campaigning need to revive the discourse around Iran? I don't even necessarily mean they have to take a position on, you know, yes, I'm going to attack. No, I'm going to let diplomacy finish. Whatever. But do you think that in a way, by not bringing it up and focusing on the campaign trail stuff, like the Israeli conscience is kind of slowly, losing the kind of the big picture here, which is like the Iran and the Iranian people, which is essentially what started this whole. If you think about it in a way, this conflict in the first place, because it was a concern of the Iranian people. So are we kind of at danger of losing that too? And do you think maybe, hopefully, possibly will regain consciousness after elections, or do you think that is there a chance that Israel might possibly be moving on?
I don't think Israel is moving on. I think that you're right that there are many, many issues, domestic and international, that are being discussed that need to be considered. Also, remember demographically, there are huge numbers of Iranian Jewish Israelis living inside Israel now, and many of them
Right.
are of voting age. So naturally, it would make sense for Iran to remain top of mind. And I also suspect if there is another development, positive or negative, concerning Iran between now and election day, perhaps that will go much higher up in the priority list. But I think in general, there is a recognition that Iran is a big issue, but perhaps it's not the most pressing issue at this very moment. But I don't think I agree that that shouldn't lead to a sense of complacency, because the Islamic Republic, while they've been scaled back to an extent militarily, and their nuclear program has been set back, there's still um, stuff there, and there's still a desire to destroy the state of Israel and to inflict harm on the region and U.S. Assets. So the threat is still very much there, and I think that's, if you look at Israel's airports, that's a huge, the best demonstration of the threat that continues to exist. The U.S. planes that continue to sit there, and I think there's a
Right.
recognition that the threat still looms large. Uh, but at the same time, these are politicians who are balancing many different issues, many different constituents. And I hope that that juggling act doesn't lead to a sense of complacency. But I would also be very surprised if they completely neglect the issue of the Islamic Republic just because of how existential it is.
Yeah, because I remember, it's ironic. It's kind of like, this is kind of happened in waves, and it's kind of happened again where, when the protests started, in Israel there was a lot of active messaging about support for the Iranian people. Netanyahu was publishing videos to the Iranian people. Ministers on, all sides of the political spectrum putting out messages, holding events, showing support, what have you. And then, Operation Rising Lion happened, and obviously, the talk kind of shifted a bit towards about, the military operations, because that was what was going on recently. And then when the time came to de-escalate from that conflict, even, I remember thinking about how, that's so weird. We're like talking about all of these like military terms, that we seem to have forgotten about the people, which is why we kind of started this. Not entirely. There's also like the threat of the weapons, but like this kind of how this whole thing started in the first place. And now it appears to be that cycle is, happening. So I guess the final question, because I can understand how, when something is happening currently, to have that in the forefront of your mind, I get it. But I guess the most important question that we need to really always keep in our minds is, no matter what ends up being the current thing, or no matter what phase the escalation of with Iran, whether it be negotiation or conflict or something in between or limited strikes or what have you, how can, we as individuals, and how can, like, countries, whatever, make sure that the topic of the people of Iran, and not Iran the regime, still stays a central focus and concern, so that they won't be abandoned.
I would say that Israel, more than most countries in the world, recognize that and understand the the very clear distinction between the Islamic Republic that is 47 years old and the people of Iran whose history and civilization spans thousands of years. You look at all the streets in every single major city in Israel. There's a street. It's called, Rehov Koresh, named after King
Yeah.
Cyrus. There's the history of through much of the 20th century of Israel and Iran sharing very strong collaborative ties. The fact that Iran was the second Muslim majority country in the world to recognize the state of Israel. I think there is a understanding there that doesn't exist in other countries. Um, and if you look at the level of engagement that you alluded to, like when an Israeli official or an Israeli citizen posts something on social media, like a message directly to the Iranian people, that is usually what gets the most amount of traction by far. I've seen it personally, like about 15% of my all of my content, whether it's Iran related or not, 15% of those views are from inside Iran. There's huge engagement there, and I think there's a huge
Wow.
synergy that exists between the people of Iran and the people of Israel and the Jewish people that's really waiting, bursting to be unlocked. Uh, and that's, I think, I agree with you that it is to an degree ironic, because if I were a politician looking for, I don't know, operating in this attention economy, one thing that gets a huge amount of attention is talking about the people of Iran. And
Right.
and that's, but as a strategy, even though obviously the content is highly important, just as a strategy, something to set yourself apart from other people is really to focus on the people of Iran. So I agree with you there.
Yeah, because, I'll be the first to admit it's not always easy, especially, from here, after, two rounds of missiles, and going into shelters and everything in between, and following elections and whatever. There's a lot of stuff all of the time. But, I mean, I guess that's why we do episodes like this, so we can remind people. But yeah, it's just, I just found myself talking about Iran, and just talking about the flip flops on the negotiations over and over and over again, and I don't, the discourse on the people themselves has just become kind of like an afterthought.
The problem is access.
Um,
The problem is access.
mm,
People, in the outs in the West don't have access to the people inside Iran, those voices. So that's why, and that was one reason why I wrote my book. It was to actually shed light on the people of Iran and to give them a voice and a face and a profession and a name. But I think there is a thirst and an interest in learning more about that. But I don't think it's I would say perhaps it may be a bit naive, is the reason why it's not being spoken about as much as I would like is not because there isn't an interest, it's because there isn't the access. And the more
Mm,
ways to amplify the voices inside Iran that are very different to the voices that you see on the state-run TV inside Iran, the better for the world.
right. So now I wanna end up on a open-ended question in the sense that when it comes to the Iranian people, not just their current plight, but the Iranian people in general, what do you think is the most important thing that our viewers should understand about the Iranian people that maybe we haven't discussed today?
The thing that I'm always really completely struck by is that the people, at least who I spoke to inside Iran and in the diaspora, who were most vocally supportive of continued operations by the US and by Israel against the Islamic Republic were Iranians themselves, with real actual skin in the game. And it's something that's really hard to wrap your head around. I remember going to a number of Nowruz parties in Brooklyn, New York, that were hosted by Nowruz is the Persian New Year, and the
Right.
parties were hosted by non-Jewish Iranian people. And the number of people who would come up to me and like urge, beg for more continued operations and activity was really quite staggering. And the reason for that is because those Iranian people, more than anyone else in the world, know what a successful operation like that could actually mean and entail. And it could
Hmm.
mean unlocking a future for the Iranian people beyond the Islamic Republic. And that's something that's really worth fighting for. So I think that's one thing that I'm always struck by, and just it goes hand in hand with the point of the Islamic Republic being completely different to the Iranian people, and the onus being on us to talk more and amplify more the voices of the Iranian peoples and separate that from the Islamic Republic.
Absolutely. Well, Jonathan, thank you for coming back and having this discussion. And I hope that we've revitalized some of the discourse. And I'm sure that the totality of this conflict is far from over, and I'm sure we'll be speaking again about it soon.
I hope so too, and thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. That's all we have for this week's episode. We sincerely hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next week, but until then, stay up to date for the latest Israel news at jpost.com.